The knife found Reuben Holloway's throat before he ever saw the hand that held it. He had been hauling in the last of his nets, salt-crusted and half-frozen, the wind off the cold straight cutting through his oilskin coat, when a shadow peeled itself away from the rocks behind his shack and became a woman built like a war hammer given flesh. Green-gray skin caught the last gray light of dusk. Tusks glinted at the corners of a mouth that was not smiling. One clawed hand had a fistful of his collar. The other pressed the flat of a curved blade so close to his skin that he felt its cold before he felt its edge. "Reuben Holloway," she said, and her voice was low and rough as gravel dragged over stone. "The fisherman of Saltmere Cove, that is you." "That is me," he managed, because lying to an orc with a knife at his throat seemed like a poor way to spend his last breath. "Though I confess I do not know why that fact interests you enough to nearly open my neck over it." "It interests me," she said, "because I have been paid good silver to bring your head back across the border. 20 pieces, Ashgrave coin, for the man who butchered a Grimhold trade envoy and 4 of his kin on the Salt Road, and left them to rot for the crows." Reuben's heart, already hammering, seemed to stop entirely. "I have never harmed an orc in my life. I have never harmed anyone in my life who did not swing at me first in the Cove Tavern, and even then only enough to make them sit down. So says every man with a rope around his neck, but something in her eyes had already changed. She was not looking at him the way a woman looks at a lamb she means to slaughter. She was looking at him the way a woman looks at a puzzle whose pieces do not quite fit the frame. Her gaze dropped to his hands, still tangled in wet net cord, callous thick from rope and oar, nicked with the small white scars of a man who had spent 28 years pulling a living out of an unforgiving sea. She turned one of his hands over in her grip, claws careful, almost gentle despite the blade still hovering an inch from his skin. "The man who did this killing," she said slowly, "left a print in blood on the envoy's own ledger. A hand, long fingers, soft palm, but for one callus here," she pressed a claw to the base of his thumb, "from a bowstring. You have no such mark. Your hands have never held a hunting bow in your life. They have held oars and nets and nothing else." "I own no bow," Reuben said, hardly daring to breathe. "I have never in my life needed to kill anything I could not eat." For a long moment the only sound was the surf grinding against the rocks below the shack, and the far-off cry of a gull that did not know or care that a man's life was balanced on the edge of an orc blade. Then, slowly, terribly, she withdrew the knife. "I do not kill on a lie," she said. "Not even a paid one." She straightened to her full height, and only then did Reuben truly see her and forget, for one dangerous heartbeat, that she had just held a blade to his throat. She wore fitted travel leathers the color of dark rust, laced snug up the sides so that they moved with her like a second skin, rather than hanging loose like a soldier's armor. A wide belt cinched at her waist hung with 2 curved short swords and a coil of rope, and vambraces etched with clan markings that caught the last light like old bronze. Her black hair was bound in a single thick braid that fell past her shoulder, and her tusks, small and neat compared to some orcs Reuben had glimpsed at trading posts, gave her smile, when at last it came, faint and considering, a dangerous, feral beauty that made his mouth go dry. "You," she said, tilting her head at him, "are either the unluckiest fisherman in the cove or someone very clever has made you look guilty of a crime you did not commit." "I have never in my life been called clever," Reuben said, "and I have certainly never been called lucky, so I suppose that leaves the other thing." Her laugh was short and surprised, like it had escaped her before she meant to allow it. "I am Zarkha Thunderroar," she said, "Sellsword of no clan and every clan when the coin is good enough. And it appears, fisherman, that you and I have a mystery to solve before I collect on this contract or refuse it entirely." Saltmere Cove was not a large place. A scatter of stone cottages and salt-bleached wooden houses climbing up from a rocky harbor, a single muddy high street with a trading post, a smithy, and the anchor and net tavern that served as the town's beating heart. It sat close enough to the border hills that on clear days the smoke of orc war camp fires could be seen rising beyond the tree line, and close enough to old grievances that most of its people still crossed themselves or spat when an orc's name was spoken. 10 years passed. The Grimhold clan and the men of the border towns had fought a bitter, bloody season of raids and reprisals before an uneasy peace had settled, thin and brittle as new ice. It was that peace the massacre of the trade envoy had shattered. Zarkha explained it to him in the dark of his own kitchen, refusing the offered chair, prowling instead near the shuttered window like a cat that did not trust a room until it had measured every exit. Zarkha was a peace envoy, she said, sent from the Grimhold war camp to treat with your town elders over grazing rights along the ridge. He and 4 kin were found on the salt road 3 days later with their throats cut and their goods untouched, which is itself strange, fisherman. A raider steals, a murderer with a grudge does not. And someone put my name on it. Someone put your hand on it, a print in Zarkha's own blood on the ledger he carried. And someone in this very town swore before the Grimhold clan's messenger that they had seen Reuben Holloway on the salt road that same night, arguing with the envoy over a debt. Reuben's jaw tightened. I have never argued with an orc over a debt in my life. I do not deal with the Grimhold clan at all. I sell fish to the trading post and nothing more. Then someone wanted the blame to land on a man too poor and too quiet to be believed when he denied it, Zarkha said, and there was something almost gentle beneath the growl of her voice. A man no one would miss enough to fight for. The words landed harder than she likely intended. Reuben had buried his mother 2 winters past, his father long before that, lost to the sea like so many cove men before him. He had no wife, no children, no brothers to stand at his back in the tavern when the talk turned ugly. He was, as she had guessed without knowing it, precisely the sort of man a clever killer would choose to frame quiet, poor, alone, and unlikely to be defended by anyone with influence enough to matter. You are not wrong, he said quietly. I do not have many who would fight for me. Zarkha's gold-flecked eyes studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind them. You have one now, she said, until I learn the truth of this. I did not travel 3 days through border wilderness to collect a false bounty on an innocent man's head. That is not the kind of sellsword I am. He should have been afraid of her still. He was not. He found himself, absurdly, grateful for the terrifying, beautiful stranger who had held a blade to his throat, and then chosen, of her own will, to lower it. The next morning brought its own dangers, of a smaller and more human kind. Word traveled fast in the cove, and by the time Reuben walked to the trading post for salt and lamp oil, half the street already knew that an orc sellsword had been seen near his shack the night before. Holloway's gone and brought a green-skinned devil right to our door, muttered old Cobb Ferris outside the smithy, loud enough to be heard. Ought to string them both up before she brings the whole Grimhold warband down on us. She has done nothing to any of you, Reuben said, more sharply than was his habit, for he was not a man given to arguing in the street. She has not raised a hand against a soul in this town. Yet, Cobb said, and spat in the mud. Zarkha, walking half a step behind Reuben's shoulder with her hood drawn low and her hands deliberately loose and empty at her sides, said nothing at all. But Reuben saw the way her jaw set, the way her eyes swept the gathering knot of men with the flat, patient watchfulness of a predator that has decided, for now, not to answer a challenge. It was not fear. He understood that immediately. It was restraint, hard-won and costly, and he found himself moving half a step closer to her without quite deciding to, so that his shoulder brushed her arm. Let them talk, he said quietly for her ears alone. Words never drowned a man yet. Only water does that, and I have made my peace with water a long time ago. She glanced sideways at him, surprise flickering across her features before settling into something warmer. You are a strange man, Reuben Holloway. So I have been told. Usually by people who mean it as an insult. I do not, she said, and the corner of her mouth curved, tusks catching the morning light, and something in Reuben's chest turned over entirely. They found their first true thread of truth 2 days later, at the trading post itself, where the post's ledger keeper, A nervous, narrow man named Petrus who flinched whenever Zarkha's shadow crossed near him let slip, under the patient, unhurried pressure of her questioning, that it had been Garrick Voss who first carried word of the murder to the Grimhold messenger, and Garrick Voss who had sworn, loudest of anyone, that he had seen Reuben on the salt road that night. Garrick Voss owned half the cove's trade in salted fish and timber, a broad, well-fed man with a merchant's smile and a merchant's cold eyes who had twice tried to buy Reuben's stretch of shoreline for a fraction of its worth and twice been refused. "He wanted my land," Reuben said slowly, the pieces settling into a shape he did not like. "The deep-water mooring. He has said as much to my face more than once." "A man who kills 5 orcs and frames his neighbor to steal a stretch of shoreline," Zarkha said, "is not a man who stops at one lie. We will need more than a ledger-keeper's nervous tongue to bring him down, fisherman. We will need proof the Grimhold clan itself will believe, and proof this town cannot shout away." That proof, when it came, arrived wrapped in chains and screaming crowd, faster and more violently than either of them had prepared for. It happened on the 4th day, in the gray hour before noon, when Reuben and Zarkha came down from the ridge road into the square to find nearly the whole of Saltmere Cove gathered in a shouting, surging knot around the old whipping post at the square's center, and chained to that post, bloodied and half-conscious, was a young orc scout, tusks barely grown in, wrists shackled in iron, a rope already looped over the crossbeam above his head. "They caught him near the tree line," someone was shouting. "Grimhold's spy come to scout us for the raid. Hang him now before the whole warband comes down on us for the envoy." Reuben felt Zarkha go rigid beside him, every muscle drawn tight as a bowstring. "That is Korath," she said, low and urgent. "A scout barely past his first hunt. He is no killer. He is a boy sent to watch the border, nothing more." "They mean to hang him," Reuben said, "for a crime we already know Garrick Voss committed." Garrick himself stood at the front of the crowd, his merchant's face flushed with something that was not quite grief and not quite fear, but wore both like a mask, urging the men around him louder than any. "Hang him, and hang him quick, before more of his kind come sniffing after Holloway's little green-skinned friend besides." The rope tightened. The boy, for he was hardly more than that, cried out, a raw, terrified sound that cut through the mob's noise and lodged itself directly in Reuben's chest. He did not remember deciding to move. He remembered only that he was suddenly running, shoving between shoulders and elbows, throwing himself bodily between the tightening rope and the men hauling it, his own hands closing over the rough hemp. "Stop!" His voice cracked over the crowd, raw and desperate, and for one startled instant the whole square went still, because Reuben Holloway had never in his life raised his voice above the ordinary business of selling fish. "This boy has killed no one. The man who murdered Vherga and his kin stands among you right now, and it is not him. Get out of the way, Holloway, before you hang beside him." Someone shouted, and hands seized his coat, hauling him backward, but before he hit the mud, a shadow moved past him faster than the eye could follow. Zarkha Thunderroar's short sword came down in one clean stroke, and the chain binding Korath's wrists parted with a shriek of severed iron. In the same motion she caught the boy as he sagged, sweeping him half behind her with one arm while her other hand came up, blade bare and gleaming, angled at the crowd that recoiled as one terrified body from the sheer, sudden fact of her. "The next hand that touches this rope," she said, and her voice carried across the whole square, flat and absolutely without doubt, "loses the arm attached to it." Silence, utter ringing silence broken only by the boy's ragged breathing and the creak of the empty rope still swinging from the crossbeam. "You would defend a Grimhold spy," someone finally dared, though the voice shook, "over your own kind." "I would defend the truth," Zarkha said, "over a mob too frightened and too lazy to look for it. This boy did not kill your envoy. I have hunted the man who did for 4 days, and he is not chained to this post." Reuben, scrambling back to his feet, found every eye in the square suddenly on him too, not with the open hatred of before, but with something more uncertain, more dangerous in its own way, because uncertainty in a frightened crowd could tip either toward mercy or toward a second target. He drew a breath and made his choice. "It is Garrick Voss," he said, loud enough for every soul in the square to hear, and he pointed, his hand steady despite the thundering of his own heart. "Ask Petrus at the trading post, whose voice first named me guilty. Ask him who benefits from my land standing empty when I am dead." Garrick Voss murdered that envoy to start a war he could profit from, and framed a man too poor to fight back for it. Garrick's face went the color of old ash. "That is a madman's lie, spat out by a green-skinned butcher's pet. Search his cellar," Zarkha said, cold and certain, "and I will wager my own blade you find a bow with a worn string, and a ledger stained with blood that is not his own." It took 3 men, Cobb Ferris himself among them, his earlier hatred curdling now into something closer to shame, to hold Garrick Voss, while 2 others ran for his house at the edge of town. It took less than a quarter-hour before they returned, one of them white-faced, carrying a hunting bow with a bowstring worn smooth in exactly the place a man's soft palm would rest, and a second ledger, hidden beneath false boards, stained dark with old blood and marked in Garrick's own careful merchant's hand with notes of debts he had meant to erase by violence. The crowd's fury, so recently aimed at a chained boy and a fisherman, turned at last, completely and finally, toward the man who had earned it. But there was no time to savor the justice of it, because even as Garrick Voss was dragged away shouting denials no one now believed, riders were already coming down off the ridge road, a full Grimhold scouting party, drawn by the very commotion in the square, weapons bared, seeing only a fisherman, a bounty sellsword who had failed her contract, and a rescued scout still bleeding at their feet. "They will not stop to ask questions," Zarkha said sharply, already hauling Korath upright, pressing him toward the tree line at the square's edge. "Not until someone has calmed them, and that will not happen in the next quarter-hour. Run, fisherman, now. Run where? Into the hills." Away from every blade in this square on both sides of it. Her hand closed hard around his wrist, claws careful even in her urgency, and for the second time in 4 days she pulled him bodily out of danger. "I did not save your neck from a false bounty only to watch it broken by a panicked war party. Move." They ran. The hills above Saltmere Cove climbed quickly into true wilderness, thick stands of pine, granite outcrops slick with the season's first frost, and beyond them the long gray shoulders of the border mountains where winter came early and stayed cruel. Zarkha led them off the ridge road within the first mile, cutting instead along a game trail she seemed to know by instinct rather than memory, Korath stumbling between them until his strength returned enough for him to run unaided, until at last, near dusk, he peeled away toward a Grimhold outrider camp he swore he could reach alone, promising to carry word of the truth back to his chief before any further blood was spilled. That left Reuben and Zarkha alone, with the mountains rising ahead of them and the first bite of true winter already sharpening the wind. "We cannot go back to the cove," Reuben said, as they made a cold, fireless camp in the lee of a granite shelf that first night. "Not until this settles. And we cannot go to your Grimhold camp either, not with half of them still believing I am the man who killed their envoy." "No," Zarkha agreed, pulling her cloak tighter and studying the darkening sky with an expression Reuben was learning to read as concern. "We cannot. Which means we go up into the high passes until word reaches both sides and cools their blood. There is an old shepherd's shelter 3 days' climb from here. It will hold against the weather if the weather does not close the pass before we reach it. And if it does." Her gold eyes met his across the small space between them, steady and unflinching. "Then we survive it anyway. I did not pull you out of a hangman's noose and a war party's path only to lose you to snow, fisherman." He should have found the prospect of a mountain winter terrifying. Instead, watching her in the failing light, her braid loosened by the wind, her hand resting easily on the hilt of a blade she had already used once to save his life, he felt something steadier than fear settle into his chest. "Then I suppose," he said, We had better climb quickly. The storm found them on the second day, exactly as Zarkha had feared it might. It came down off the peaks without warning, a wall of white wind that swallowed the trail behind them and turned the world into a shrieking, blinding chaos of snow. Reuben had weathered sea storms all his life, had watched waves taller than his shack come apart against the harbor rocks, but he had never felt cold like this, cold that seemed to reach past skin and coat and bone to something deeper, cold that whispered patiently that all he needed to do was stop moving and it would end. "Do not stop," Zarkha's voice cut through the howl, close against his ear, her arm hooked hard through his to keep him upright as the wind tried to tear them apart. "Reuben, look at me. Do not stop." "I am not stopping," he shouted back, though his lips had gone numb enough that the words came out slurred. They found the shepherd's shelter more by Zarkha's stubborn, unerring sense of direction than by sight, a low stone hut half buried in a fold of the mountain, its door frozen shut until she put her full strength against it and broke the ice with one shoulder. They fell through the doorway together into a darkness that was, by contrast, almost warm, and Zarkha kicked the door shut behind them against the howling white while Reuben sank, shaking, onto the packed dirt floor. "You are frozen through," she said, kneeling beside him, and there was real fear in her voice now, raw and unguarded in a way he had not heard from her before. "Your lips are blue, fisherman. This is no time for pride." "I was not aware I had any pride left to spend," he managed, teeth chattering. "Feel free to do whatever you think will keep me from dying in a shepherd's hut, Zarkha Thunderroar." What she did was strip away his sodden coat with hands that shook only slightly, and her own outer leathers besides, and pull him against the whole warm length of her body, wrapping every hide and blanket she could find from the shelter's meager stores around them both, her arms banded tight around him, her chin resting against the top of his head. "This is not," she said, her voice rough against his hair, "how I imagined this journey ending." "Which part?" Reuben asked, some ember of dry humor surviving even the cold. "The almost freezing to death, or the orc Sellsword holding me like I am something precious?" Her arms tightened, and beneath the cold and the exhaustion and the fear, he felt her laugh, quiet and real. "Both, perhaps. I have killed men for less coin than the bounty on your head, fisherman, and yet here I am, warming you with my own body instead of collecting it." "I am glad," he said honestly, "that you looked at me twice before deciding." "So am I," she said, and something in the way she said it made his heart climb into his throat. They stayed like that through the worst of the night, the wind screaming outside the stone walls. The two of them pressed together in the dark for warmth that slowly became something more than mere survival. Reuben felt the moment it shifted, felt Zarkha's hand still against his chest, felt her breath change, felt her pull back just far enough to look at him in the near-total dark, her gold eyes somehow still visible, still burning. "You are not afraid of me," she said. It was not quite a question. "I was the first night," he admitted, "for about the length of time it took you to lower your blade. And now?" "Now," he said, and found, despite the cold, despite the fear of the storm still raging beyond the walls, that his voice was steady. "I am more afraid of what happens when this storm ends and you decide there is no reason left to stay." Something in her face cracked open at that, some careful, guarded thing she had kept locked away since the moment she first held a knife to his throat. "There is a custom among my people," she said quietly, "for when a warrior finds someone worth more than any bounty she was ever paid to claim, we do not ask softly, the way I hear your kind sometimes does. We claim, and we are claimed in turn if the other is willing. And if I am willing, then you would be mine," she said, openly, before my clan and yours, in a way neither could pretend not to see. "It is not a small thing I am asking, Reuben Holloway. I have spent my whole life being a small thing no one thought to claim," he said, and reached up, despite the cold, despite the trembling in his own hands, to touch her jaw, tracing the curve of it up to where her tusk caught what little light there was. "I find I do not mind at all being claimed by you." Her kiss, when it came, was not gentle. It carried the same fierce, unhesitating certainty she brought to everything, her hand fisting in his hair, her mouth hot against his despite the frozen night around them, and Reuben met it with everything he had. Every bit of loneliness he had carried through 28 winters finally answered. When she finally drew back, both of them breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his, tusks careful not to catch his skin, and murmured something low and orcish he did not understand. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," she said, "you are mine, and I am cursed and glad of it both." He laughed, low and disbelieving and entirely happy, and pulled her back down into the warmth of their shared blankets, and the storm outside raged on, unimportant now against the fact of her arms around him. The storm broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world scoured white and impossibly quiet. They stayed one more day in the shepherd's hut regardless, not entirely for the sake of caution, though Reuben would have sworn to anyone who asked that caution was the whole of the reason, Zarkha's hands mapping the shape of him with a warrior's frank appreciation, and an unhurried tenderness that surprised him each time. His own hesitant touches met not with impatience, but with a low, pleased rumble in her chest that he was coming to recognize as something like happiness. What passed between them that day was slow and warm, and entirely unlike the desperate huddling of the storm's first night. A claiming completed in full, gentle in its own fierce way. Two people who had each spent too long being overlooked finally, thoroughly seen. Afterward, wrapped together in the last of the hut's furs while pale winter sun crept through the single narrow window, Zarkha traced the line of an old scar on his forearm, souvenir of some long-ago storm at sea, and said, "Tell me of your life before I put a knife to your throat, fisherman." "There is not much to tell. I fish. I mend nets. I bury the people I love and keep going because the sea does not care whether a man is sad, only whether he shows up to work it." "That sounds lonely." "It was," he said simply, "until 4 days ago." She kissed the scar beneath her fingers, unexpectedly gentle. "You will not be lonely again," she said, with the flat certainty of a woman who did not make promises she did not intend to keep. "I have decided this, and Thunderroars are not known for changing their minds." They came down out of the mountains on the 6th day, to find that the world below had not stood still in their absence. Word had traveled, as word always does in border country, faster than any single messenger could carry it. By the time Reuben and Zarkha picked their way down the last of the frozen game trail toward Saltmere Cove, they found the square transformed Garrick Voss already in chains himself, held for the cove's own magistrate, and for whatever justice the Grimhold clan chose to demand. The truth of the bloodied ledger and the worn bow having done its slow, grinding work through 6 days of investigation, the town could no longer avoid. And waiting at the square's edge, flanked by a dozen Grimhold riders in full war paint, stood a broad, gray-tusked orc Reuben had never met but recognized instantly by the way every Grimhold rider straightened at his presence. Chief Grosk, war chief of the Grimhold clan, come himself to see the truth of the matter settled. The chief's eyes found Zarkha first, and something passed between them, some old history Reuben could not read. "Thunderroar," Chief Grosk said, his voice a deep rumble that carried easily across the square. "You were paid to bring me a killer's head. You return instead with the killer's chains already forged by human hands, and a fisherman at your side who does not look much like a corpse." "Because he is not the killer, Chief," Zarkha said, standing tall, unflinching before him, her hand finding Reuben's without hesitation, in full view of clan and townsfolk alike. "The killer stands chained over there, and I have proof enough to satisfy even your council's suspicion, should you require it laid out again." Grosk's gaze moved to their joined hands, and something like understanding, old, weary, not entirely unkind, crossed his broad features. "And this," he said, "explains why my Sellsword returns without her bounty but with a fisherman's hand in hers instead." "It does," Zarkha said without a flicker of shame. "I claimed him in the high pass before the storm and after it. He is mine, chief, by every right our people recognize, and I will defend that claim against clan or crown alike, should either think to dispute it." The square held its breath. Reuben felt every eye upon them, cove townsfolk who had, only a week ago, spat at the sight of an orc walking their street, and Grimhold riders who had ridden here half expecting a battle over a murdered envoy. He felt Zarkha's hand tighten around his, steady and sure, and found that whatever fear he might have carried into this moment had simply, quietly burned away. Chief Grosk studied them both for a long, weighing moment, and then unexpectedly he laughed, a great booming sound that startled the nearest horses. "The Thunderroar line was always stubborn," he said. "Your grandmother claimed a human blacksmith the same way, over the whole council's objection, and lived to see them all admit she had chosen well. I will not waste breath arguing with the same fire in her granddaughter's blood." He inclined his head toward Reuben, an oddly formal gesture from so fearsome a figure. "Fisherman, you have my clan's thanks for the truth, and my sellsword's heart besides, it seems, though I suspect the second gift will prove the harder one to manage." "I intend to spend the rest of my life managing it gladly, chief," Reuben said, and found his voice steadier than he had any right to expect. The magistrate of Saltmere Cove, a thin, careful man named Elias Thorne, who had watched the whole exchange with visible relief that no further blood needed spilling in his square, cleared his throat into the settling quiet. "Garrick Voss will answer for his crimes before both our law and, should your clan wish it, before Grimhold justice as well," he said. "And Reuben Holloway's name is cleared fully and publicly before this whole town as witness. I believe that settles the matter the Crown would care about." "It settles the matter the Crown cares about," Zarkha agreed. "It does not settle the matter I care about, which is considerably more personal." Cobb Ferris, of all people, was the one who broke the tension that followed, stepping forward from the crowd with his cap in his hands and an expression of genuine, awkward shame. "Holloway," he said, "I said an ugly thing to you outside my smithy about you and yours." His eyes flicked to Zarkha, then back to Reuben. "I was wrong to say it and wrong to think it, and I am sorry for both." "You believed what fear told you to believe," Reuben said, without malice, for he found he had little room left in his heart that day for old grudges. "I cannot say I have never done the same. Let us call it settled, Cobb, and be neighbors again." It was, in its own quiet way, as fitting an ending to the town's fear as any grand declaration might have been. An old man's plain apology, accepted plainly in return, while beside him the orc Sellsword, who had once been paid to end his life, stood instead as the surest guard he would ever have. There remained only the matter of Garrick Voss's final reckoning, which came 3 days later, swift and without further violence, when the magistrate's own inquiry, bolstered by Grimhold testimony that the murdered envoy's stolen goods had in fact been traced to a buyer in a neighboring trade town, a buyer Garrick himself had dealt with under a false name, confirmed every piece of the truth Zarkha had first sniffed out on a dark dockside 4 days after the killing. Garrick was taken east under guard to face the Crown's own courts for murder and incitement to war, and Saltmere Cove, battered and ashamed of its own quick hatred, settled slowly back into the ordinary rhythm of a fishing town, though it was a town changed, in small ways, by what it had nearly done to an innocent man and the orc who had refused to let it happen. Reuben sold his shack. It was not an easy decision, not entirely. The shack had been his father's before him, and his father's fathers before that, 3 generations of Holloways who had pulled their living from the same stretch of unforgiving coast. But the deep-water mooring Garrick Voss had so badly wanted was, once the man's ill-gotten holdings were seized and redistributed by the Crown's own justice, sold instead at fair price to a young Cove family with 4 children and no boat of their own, and Reuben found he did not begrudge them the trade one bit. "You are certain of this?" Zarkha said, the morning he closed the shack's door for the last time, her arm looped easily through his as they stood on the frost-rimed dock. "Leaving the only life you have known, for a war camp full of tents and cookfires, and my clan's endless questions about the human who tamed a Thunderroar. No one tamed you, Reuben said, laughing. I'm fairly certain it was the other way around. Perhaps, she allowed, tusks flashing in a grin, we tamed each other a little. As for being certain, he went on, more seriously taking her hand, feeling the familiar rough strength of it, the same hand that had once held a blade to his throat and now simply, easily held his. I have spent my whole life being the man no one thought worth fighting for. You fought for me before you even decided to love me. I would be a fool to let that go because I am attached to a leaking roof and a view of rocks I have memorized since I was 6 years old. There will be a new view, she said. The Grimhold camp sits above a river valley thick with pine, and beyond it on clear days you can see all the way to the northern peaks. It is not the sea. I know the sea has always been yours. The sea will still be there, Reuben said. I can visit it. What I could not have in a shack alone on the shore was you. I choose you, Zarkha. Openly, the way your people would understand it, and however my people understand it too, for whatever that is worth to either of us. Her eyes, when she looked at him then, were bright with something that might, in a woman less fierce, have been called tears. It is worth everything, she said, low and rough, to a woman who has spent her whole life being feared, and never once until you being chosen. The journey to the Grimhold war camp took 2 days along the ridge road, now clear of both storm and mob alike, and Reuben found himself watching the world change gradually beneath his boots, cove stone and salt-bleached wood giving way slowly to pine forest, and pine forest at last opening onto the wide river valley, where the war camp sprawled, hide tents in ordered rows, cookfares sending up threads of smoke into a sky gone the deep gold of late afternoon. The sound of drums and voices carrying on the cold air. He would be lying if he said he felt no fear, walking into that camp on his own 2 feet rather than dragged as a prisoner or delivered as a corpse. The first human many of these orcs had ever seen who was not an enemy on a battlefield or a bounty to be collected. Eyes turned as they passed between the tents, curious, wary, some openly hostile in the way old wars leave scars that do not fade merely because a peace treaty says they should. But Zarkha walked beside him with her chin high and her hand never once leaving his, and when murmurs rose among the gathered warriors, she answered them plainly, without flinching, in the same tone she might have used to announce a kill. This is Reuben Holloway, she said, again and again, to elder and warrior and curious child alike, my chosen mate, claimed in the high pass and confirmed before Chief Grosk himself. Any who doubt the claim may test it against my blade. None did. Chief Grosk himself received them that evening at the great fire in the camp center, where the whole clan had gathered, drawn by curiosity and by the particular electric hum that follows any announcement of a claiming among a people who valued fierce, chosen love as highly as they valued strength in battle. The chief listened as Zarkha recounted before the assembled clan the full truth of the false bounty, Garrick Voss's crimes, the storm in the high pass, and the claiming that had followed it. And when she finished, he rose, and the whole fire-lit clearing fell silent to hear his judgment. A Thunderroar's claim is not lightly given, Chief Grosk said, nor lightly overturned once made before witnesses. I have known this warrior since she first lifted a blade too large for her own arms, and I have never once seen her choose foolishly, even when she has chosen fiercely. His gaze settled on Reuben, weighing, not unkind. Fisherman. You do not have a warrior's arms, nor a warrior's scars beyond what the sea itself has carved into you. But you stood in a mob's path for a boy you barely knew, and you stood beside my sellsword when lesser men would have run. That is its own kind of courage, and I will not insult it by pretending our ways demand only the kind that swings a blade. He raised a hand, and the clan, as one, raised an answering cheer that shook the smoke rising off the great fire, drums picking up a rhythm that Reuben felt in his very bones. And Zarkha turned to him, firelight dancing gold across her face, her smile wide and unguarded in a way he had not yet seen from her, not even in the warmest hours of their storm-bound night in the mountains. "There is one more custom left to complete the claiming," she said, close against his ear, her breath warm despite the cold night air. "Among my people, when a warrior's claim is confirmed before the clan, she does not simply walk her chosen one to her tent like some ordinary guest. She carries him." Reuben laughed, startled and delighted both. "Carries me. It is a mark of pride," Zarkha said, mock solemn, though her eyes danced with the same delight he felt. "A declaration to the whole clan that I do not merely tolerate you, fisherman, but that I want you, that I choose to bear you into my home before every eye that cares to watch, so none may ever mistake the truth of what you are to me. And if I would rather walk on my own 2 feet, out of some foolish leftover pride, then I would remind you," she said, already moving, already sweeping him up against her chest with an ease that spoke to every bit of the terrible strength he had first glimpsed the night she held a blade to his throat, "that you promised, in that shepherd's hut, to be claimed however my people understood the claiming. This is how we understand it." He did not truly protest, could not, laughing too hard, his arms looping instinctively around her neck as she carried him past the great fire, and through the ranks of the clan, drums and cheers, rising around them into the cold, star-thick night. Every face he passed turned not in the old hatred of a border war, but in the bright, approving noise a clan makes when one of its fiercest warriors has finally, openly, chosen someone to love. She carried him all the way to the wide, fur-lined tent at the camp's edge that was, she told him, hers alone until that very night, and would from that night forward be theirs together. And only when the tent flap fell closed behind them, muffling the drums and the cheering to a distant, contented murmur, did she finally set him down, her hands lingering at his waist, her forehead resting against his in the warm dark. "Welcome home, Reuben Holloway," she said softly. "I have never had one of those before," he admitted. "Not really, not since I was a boy with both my parents still living. I did not know it would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like I finally stopped waiting for something bad to happen," he said, "and started simply being glad instead." Zarkha Thunderroar, fiercest sellsword the border war camps had seen in a generation, who had once been hired with 20 pieces of Ashgrave silver to end his life on a dark dockside, kissed him then with a gentleness that belied every fearsome story ever told about her kind, and murmured against his mouth, "Then be glad, fisherman. I intend to see that you never have cause to stop." Outside, the drums played on into the night, and the fires of the Grimhold war camp burned bright against the cold border dark, and Reuben Holloway, once the loneliest man on a rocky, unforgiving coast, slept that night, and every night after in the arms of the woman who had looked at him once, seen the truth beneath a false and deadly lie, and chosen, against every expectation of her fearsome trade, to save him instead. In the seasons that followed, the story of the sellsword who had switched sides for a fisherman's honest hands traveled the border country the way all good stories do, twisted a little in the telling, embroidered here and there by tavern keepers who liked a dramatic pause before the part where the knife came away from the throat, but true enough in its bones that both Grimhold clan and Saltmere Cove alike came to tell it not as a warning about the dangers of the border, but as proof that the old hatreds did not have to be the only inheritance either people passed down to their children. Reuben did visit the sea again, as he had promised himself he would, walking down sometimes with Zarkha at his side to trade fresh Grimhold tanned hides for cove-caught fish at the same trading post where Petrus the ledger-keeper, no longer nervous around orc shadows, greeted them now by name. Old Cobb Ferris shod Zarkha's mount without flinching, and the children of the family who had bought Reuben's old shack grew up thinking it entirely ordinary that a fisherman and an orc sellsword might walk the docks together, hand in hand, laughing at some private joke, utterly unbothered by the stares of strangers passing through. And in the war camp, among the hide tents and the cookfares and the drums that still sometimes rose at night in celebration of some warrior's fierce, chosen love. Zarkha Thunderroar continued to take contracts when the mood struck her border disputes. The occasional bandit chief grown too bold. Nothing so dark again as the lie that had first brought her to a dark dockside with a blade drawn and murder. She had believed on her mind. But she always came home. That was the thing Reuben treasured most, more than the drums, more than the cheering clan, more even than the memory of that first storm-bound night in the mountains. That no matter how far her Sellsword's road carried her, she came home, every time, to the tent at the camp's edge, to the fisherman she had once been paid to kill and had instead chosen, with her whole fierce and formerly guarded heart, to love. "I used to think," Reuben told her once, late on a quiet winter evening much gentler than the storm that had first bound them together, the two of them sharing a single carved wooden bowl of stew by their own small fire, "that I would grow old alone on that rocky shore, and no one would much notice when I finally stopped coming down to the docks." Zarkha's hand found his beneath the bowl, claws careful, grip sure. "I noticed," she said simply. "I will always notice you, Reuben Holloway. That is the whole of my claim, and I do not intend to ever let it lapse." He did not doubt her. He had learned in the space of one brutal winter and the fierce, devoted woman it had given him, that a Thunderroar's word, once given, held stronger than any stone keep, any border treaty, any old and bitter war. He was, at last, and forever after, thoroughly, gloriously chosen, and he intended to spend every remaining day of his life being glad of it.